Thank you everyone for joining us for our spring quarter global community hour. We have these global community hours for students, faculty, and staff each term to really promote an international community at Santa Clara University and really provide an opportunity for discussion and for people to come together around different international and intercultural themes. We started the global community hours really in 2016 following the travel ban, actually. And they became a really wonderful vehicle to bring people together. And when we are on campus, we enjoy the opportunity to have lots of informal conversation with these as well. I'm Susan Popko. I'm the Associate Provost for International Programs. And our topic for this term is race and identity in a global context. And we have a really small group with us today. And so we wanted to do something a little bit more informal. I think we'll have lots of time to kind of talk through some of these issues and lots of opportunity for kind of discussion going forward. So appreciate everyone joining and the opportunity to have some conversation around this toward the end. I am going to share my screen and then would encourage folks to use the view in the right-hand corner to toggle so that you can see who else may be joining in conversations or who are speaking. So. Great. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about how we think of race, both inside the US and outside of the US. And we're very, with the racial justice conversations that are taking place, it's been really key for us to have these conversations in different ways with different audiences on campus. And we wanted to talk a little bit about how these kinds of conversations impact those in our community from other countries, our students, faculty, and staff. So why is this important to SCU? To give a little bit of background, Santa Clara University hosts approximately 1,400 5% of all of our undergraduate students and about 34% of our graduate students. Our international students mostly come from India and China, and then a smattering of all of our other countries. And so in our experience of our international students, it's really important to understand who's here as well. In addition to our students whom we support for their immigration status, we also work with students we call global nomads, or you may have heard the term third culture kids. These are students who are US citizens who may or may not have ever lived in the United States before. They might have grown up abroad in another country, or more likely a range of different countries, and really feel an affinity, a cultural affinity for more than one country being home. When they come to the US, these students, typically are very comfortable in integrating in U.S. culture, but underneath the surface, often really find the cultural intersections to be challenging. So we also work with those students. In addition, Santa Clara University has a transnational faculty and staff who are U.S. citizens, but who may identify strongly with other cultures. They bring their own perspectives on race and identity from their home cultures and countries when they come into the classroom and into our campus events. And SCU has international partners with universities around the world. We rely on our partners to develop academic programs, initiatives, meetings, conferences, co-taught courses that really broaden the experience of a Santa Clara education, both in and outside of the classroom. And so as we are working with our partners, some of whom come to visit us physically, some of whom engage with us virtually, it's really important that we are being expansive in how we think of the conversation that we are having around race and identity. I would also say that being a global university, part and parcel includes understanding global perspectives on race and identity, and recognizing that there are frameworks outside of the American framework for looking at this. And being an inclusive and equitable university means cultivating intercultural understanding and learning from others. I wanted to just say a word on race versus ethnicity. We often you might hear these terms used interchangeably, but I think it's really important just to kind of be aware of these differences and how they manifest themselves when we're looking at communication with audiences from other countries. So race tends to be used based on physical appearance, while ethnicity really refers to cultural markers of social groups, religion, language, common background, things like that. So while, in a country like the US, of course, we deal with both race and ethnicity, depending what the issue is that we are discussing. In countries like India, in Japan, where race may be less of a crucial issue, but ethnicity is absolutely at the forefront of the current issues and discussions that people are having. So when we're thinking about race and ethnicity in the US on our campus and talking about this, being really attuned to the idea that both of these elements come into play when we're looking at our international audience. If we only talk about race, we're sort of excluding people from this conversation who really have a lot to say and a lot to participate in it. But when we talk about race and ethnicity, we are broadening that framework to really provide a more inclusive framework for these kinds of discussions. I wanted to share this next slide. I know it might just look like a bunch of little colored boxes all over the screen. I love this slide because it shows a couple of things. This is the US Census on race and the different ways over time that the US federal government decided to categorize people by race and collect information on people. And you don't have to absorb the detail of this. What I think is significant is to notice from 1790 until 2000, what you can see is how these social constructions of race by the US federal government have evolved over time based on current political needs and issues related to waves of immigration and how this manifests itself in US society. And so I think that just looking at this reinforces a couple of things. One, race is a social construct, of course, and two, that it is typically a construct by sort of a government or the kind of identity of a nation state that is organizing this to manage its population, the laws of a particular country. And so there really is this kind of governmental legal sort of framework that is nation bound. There would be certainly similarities with other countries, but understanding that this is the framework that sets the stage in the US specifically for legal conversations, for governmental allocation of resources, all of these kinds of things. And this is how the US government has decided to do it, unlike any other government, perhaps, is I just think a really key point to kind of thinking about race in the US. I wanted to show just a couple of examples of other places to show different constructions of race to give us a sense of so this slide I think is really it's kind of interesting to look at. So New Spain, what is that? This is basically a colonial paradigm. When Spain was the colonial power, how did Spain describe the race of people under their Spanish colonial dominion? So this included, what we think of now as Latin America. This included the Philippines. This was how the Spanish decided to divide things up. This was their framework for, organizing resources and laws and those principles. And so if you go into kind of the racial frameworks today, there's a lot on Brazil in particular, you'll see the vestiges of these original frameworks that existed that were imposed on, people in many countries all over the world from Spain. I think it's just an interesting framework that they decided to lump everyone all in one. So what the Spanish referred to as the insulares, that was folks who were in the Philippines, and then a lot of their reaction to race was what they considered were the indigenous people in Latin America, and they came up with all kinds of categories for that. So just to point out here that really dominating colonial societies over time were the originators of these constructs. Just in contrast, to give you an example, this is a quick and dirty snapshot of the construction of race and ethnicity in South Africa. This has evolved over time with the various racial political situation in South Africa under apartheid. They had different categories. And so I think it's just important to see that if you look at, for example, Santa Clara University's demographics, the categories that we use are different, right, than the categories that might be familiar to a person coming from South Africa, whether they, sort of however they self-identify with those categories. And then thinking about places where we really are looking at ethnicity more than race, there's been some really interesting pieces written recently about Japan. I think because of Japan's massive declining population and the huge influx of workers going to Japan from other places, race and ethnicity has become an issue for how Japan thinks of itself, what type of a nation is it. And as you can see, basically, almost 100% of people in Japan are identified as Japanese, but it doesn't mean there are not issues of race and ethnicity in Japan, for sure. And so the categories that Japan considers relevant to understanding race and ethnicity in that country: Korean, the largest non-Japanese population; Chinese, the Ainu, which are the indigenous people in Japan, and a category that I've only seen recently, anyone here with lots of experience in Japan may know more about this, but the Nikajin, really, who are Japanese migrants who are returning to Japan. So a lot of people from Latin America, places like Peru, for example, that for generations lived in other countries but are now coming back to Japan. The Japanese have another name for them. And then they consider the Okinawans also different from Japanese. So from an American racial perspective, we would in our U.S. construction of race box, we would put all of these people into the category of Asian or Asian American in our box, right? But you can see that these categories are really distinct and have really complex implications for people who self-identify with these areas in Japan, for example. Another way that this is really important for us to understand at Santa Clara University is the implications of kind of how these different cultures come to the US and interact in this way. So a country like India that we don't tend to think of as having multiple races, but certainly a enormous complexity of ethnicity and identity. And we have a wonderfully large population in the US. You may have seen in the fall, we made the news because 30 women from Cisco alleged caste discrimination and filed a lawsuit against discrimination based on caste from other Indian employees at Cisco. And so we made, Silicon Valley made all of the news in that time period. And so I think, just recognizing that this is now a facet of our culture, right? A facet of what it is that we need to be thinking about when we're looking at the complexities of race and ethnicity, and how this can help us be sensitive to what we might want to think about when we're working with students and faculty and staff on our campus. The Indian construction of caste really comes with 4 different main groups, and there are all kinds of scholars who go into great detail about what all of these constructs mean. I think the important thing for us to understand is that these constructs of caste in India are 1,000 years old. And if you talk with Indian people here, they can talk with you at length about how caste has impacted their life in India, how it manifests itself in their relationships, and how they sort of go about navigating things in their home country, and also how it impacts their experience here in Silicon Valley, where we have a very large and very diverse population of people from India. So I wanted to take a moment and really think about what can we do we're holding a lot of information sessions on campus about race. We're talking about different aspects of race in the US. And these are crucial conversations for us to be having on our campus. But I would like to suggest that we also think when we're having these conversations about how we can be really inclusive and bringing people from across our campus and our community into these conversations. So I think there's a few things that we can do as we are planning programs, presentations, holding discussions that include students, faculty, and staff. One is to understand that countries have different social constructions of race. That's it. Just understand that, start from that framework, recognize we don't have the correct way that race is understood, and that other people bring a different understanding and different experiences of their own identity when they participate in our community. In conversations, consider expanding our conversations to frame the discussion around race and ethnicity, not just race, and really understand that that provides an avenue for others to participate in new ways. Acknowledge that the conversation, when we're having a conversation from a US perspective, that it comes from that. Acknowledge that this is a US construct, and it may not be the construct that everyone has a direct experience of in the conversation. And validate those different experiences. Understand that in many countries, discrimination happens on the basis of ethnicity rather than just race. All you have to do is listen to the news to hear about all kinds of ethnic conflict that really is based on ethnicity and ethnic tensions and doesn't fit into categories of race at all. And so in the US, I think we're not as accustomed to thinking of discrimination in that way, but recognize that for many people in the world, it is a key part of their personal lived experience that they bring to any discussion on race and ethnicity. When working with students, we can ask students from other countries how they self-identify in that country. Approach difference with curiosity rather than judgment. We've got this wonderfully diverse group of students, faculty, and staff on our campus and in our community, and it's a really wonderful opportunity to learn from them and to help consider our own perspectives and how we can develop a broader understanding of others who are part of our community. And support and validate students in their own self-identification that may not follow US constructs of race through listening and learning. So I think this is really important. I think sometimes we have heard stories about a student from another country who brings an individual experience of race and identity to a US conversation and sort of being shut down or being said, well, this conversation isn't about you, or your contributions aren't contributing to this. And I think being sensitive to different perspectives that can actually enhance our understanding of an issue rather than excluding people from participating in it is really key. I wanted to also just kind of mention, in this slide, when we're looking at students from other countries, I think we often use the term international students to mean students from other countries, but I want to sort of just take a moment to parse that. I think international student has an identity framework based on immigration. We use that in many ways because we are actually supporting the immigration status of these students in very key ways. But when we are talking with about different kinds of international issues, transnational issues, people coming and going from different countries and cultures, that really doesn't have anything to do with identity and immigration status. It has to do with where someone may be residing. So, just as we may have many US citizens living abroad in other countries who self-identify with another dominant culture from that country more than they do from the US, or they may be a US citizen in another country struggling with the same kind of travel issues that non-US citizens are experiencing right now. Those are just kind of things to think about as we're kind of using this vocabulary. When we use international student as a shorthand for people coming from other countries, as a shorthand for those issues, I think it just emphasizes the sort of immigrant context of their identity, and that may or may not be appropriate for the student at that time. Um, so, so I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how we can approach conversations of race and ethnicity on campus, and talk a little bit about sort of an intercultural framework for how we engage with difference. So as part of our work in global engagement, part of our sort of disciplinary identity is about really seeking out difference, finding people and experiences that are different from what we know every day in and day out as our own experience, and developing strategies to communicate with people who are different from ourselves, developing strategies for learning about places that are outside of the US. And a lot of the scholarly work that has been done around this really comes from the basis of supporting US students going to study abroad in other countries, US people, business people living abroad for work, and the intercultural competency and intercultural communication lens is really from the framework of helping Americans translate what is going on in the experience that they're having in another country. And that work is very important to us. It is a crucial part of what we do in our study abroad program. It's built into every pre-departure orientation. It is built into the resources that we have developed around diversity and identity for departments across the university, engaging with students on programs abroad. But I wanted to just call attention to the fact that the scholarly work on race in a global context has, for the most part, not transpired as a theme or a discipline. There is a lot of work done on particular countries and understanding race and ethnicity in Brazil, in Japan, in South Africa, and of course the US, but kind of something that themes or scholarly pieces that bring all of that together don't tend to focus on race and ethnicity, but tend to really fall back on kind of intercultural communication and intercultural competencies. So I think that this is an emerging field for scholarship. I think it's really started to be discussed much more recently since the death of George Floyd and the last year's racial justice movement, which I think is a great thing. And so as we go forward, those of us who are working in international and intercultural learning, I think are really trying to find other ways to both bring in theoretical sources and ways to help people engage in these issues, but also to find really pragmatic strategies for implementing successful ways of dealing with race in a global context for diverse campus communities that have a lot of international students here in the US. So I wanted to just highlight one sort of piece. This is from the Developing Intercultural Competencies Manual, and it's just a framework called story circles. And this has been a framework, it's often used in development work. So when nonprofit organizations or quasi-organizations are going to developing countries to help through the United Nations or other agencies, they have initial exercises that they will do in local communities to build a relationship with people they don't know before they start engaging in strategies to help support the local community. And so I think that the framework of this is just, it's a nice framework for us to consider in our own practice. The story circle framework makes the assumption that all people are connected through human rights. There is the ability to find common ground. Every person has inherent dignity and worth. And I think that's a really important starting place, and one that makes sense to undergird our campus conversations around race and ethnicity. And so I think the other pieces that to highlight from the story circles, which are, it's really building in strategies for shared experiences and shared storytelling and reflection and cultivating questions. Understand that every person has a personal experience that can be shared of their experience of race, of their experience of ethnicity and identity. And we all have something to learn from others, and hearing about those stories and that experience can be such a powerful tool for helping us really understand different perspectives and consider ways that we can build common ground around areas that have similarities, and also deepen our own understanding about areas where there is difference. So listening for understanding and having those kinds of conversations, I think, is in our intercultural work, we really believe that this is transformational work and transformational learning. And so as we are working on our campus to develop workshops or opportunities for students, faculty, and staff to come together to talk about these issues, this is a really, this idea of kind of shared stories and learning from one another, I think, is a really kind of straightforward idea that we might consider building into our own conversations and our own practices moving forward. So as I mentioned when we started, we had a really small group RSVP for this event. And so we wanted to make sure that we had lots of opportunity for discussion, questions about this. Wanted to, because we have a small group, I think there's an easy framework for folks to kind of chime in here. I did want to highlight one resource if this is something that you're interested in considering. There's a fantastic podcast called Rough Translation, and they did a session on this that was all about people from other countries coming to the US, usually as students, and talking about their experience of being sort of smacked in the face with US racial constructs and how that manifested itself for them in their stories. So I do encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about this to check it out. So with that, I want to open up the room for discussion, questions, observations, and feel free to unmute yourself and just chime in. I think we're a small group here and have the opportunity for discussion. I'm curious if folks have had a direct experience where they've observed sort of a culture clash between kind of US constructs of race and ethnicity and the kind of global experience of these issues. Stop sharing my screen so we can see. Well, any questions or any comments anyone would like to make?
I think it's kind of interesting to think about how, so for example, like the caste system in New Spain, serves a completely different purpose than, for example, like chattel slavery in the United States. Like the outcome that each of those systems was looking for was completely different. In one case, so like the government of Spain, for example, was more or less still aligned towards the way that the government had been set up in the Middle Ages. So with the Spanish Cortez and the Spanish king sort of sitting at the top of the pyramid. And then, so for example, in New Spain, it was ruled by a viceroy. And so that viceroy had his own sort of what you would think of as like a high court. So like it was called an audiencia. And so like that was the top tier of Spanish government. And so the way that the Spanish government saw itself was that there were these people who had a blood lineage at the top because their parents had been nobles in Spain, or they had been among the first conquistadors to settle in New Spain, so on and so forth. And then the way that the caste system was structured downward was based upon like the percentage of, I guess, what you would call like, so for example, like the Criollo class was built out of a mixture of people who were part native and in part the descendants of like European settlers. And so the way that the system wasn't set up, it wasn't necessarily built for like economic exploitation, like the system in the United States was, but more set up for like social organization. Because like the major idea about social organization coming out of the Middle Ages in places like Spain was based more around this idea of like the social hierarchy is put in place to prevent like anarchy in society. You can't just have people who had no money and no access to power jumping into elite positions in the government because of the fact that there wasn't like like social infrastructure in place to like elevate those people. So for example, if you were born like if you were born, say like an Indio in the caste system in New Spain, and you were you were part of your tribe, and somehow for some reason maybe your tribe discovered a gold mine or something like that, and you become incredibly wealthy. It wasn't like you could just you couldn't just go to school suddenly. There wasn't like a university that was accessible to you. And so the most important thing in the Spanish caste system was enforcing this particular structure of society. It wasn't like the economic exploitation or anything like that. And so what you find over time with the Spanish caste system is that it sort of eventually transitions into an economic system. And as it transitions into this economic system over the course of its several hundred years of existence, you find that the barriers in between, for example, like the mestizo class and then like the criollo class, for example, like break down as it becomes more and more, first of all, impossible to tell whose lineage is what. And then also as these people from the bottom tiers sort of start to, gain more wealth and more influence in a society that was always, from the very beginning, a minority of Europeans. And that happens actually relatively quickly. And you can see like distinctly over time, people who are from the lower orders of the caste system in New Spain gradually start to get more privileges and more privileges. But from the very beginning, people who are in, like, for example, like the mestizo class are able to hold positions in government. They're able to have their own local elections. And from the point of view of the way that the Spanish government sees the caste system, tribal organizations are supposed to remain in place. The town governments are allowed to rule themselves. It's very much like a hands-off system. So like contrasting it with like, chattel slavery in the United States, like there was no opportunity for, like someone who was born a slave in the United States, in the 19th century to advance out of that. I mean, like you weren't even allowed to learn to read. There weren't laws like that prohibited the advancement of people in the Spanish caste system. And I'm not saying that to defend the Spanish caste system. I think from a modern perspective, it's very much like, we definitely wouldn't want to do that. But from the point of view of the Spanish at the time, well, they had a similar system that was in place in Spain and throughout the empire of Charles V, to be honest, which included people who were Dutch, people who were German, people who were Flemish, people who were Italian.
Yeah, I think that's great, Justin. I mean, I think that historic origins of how these different systems evolved and what the goals were of the sort of people imposing these systems on others is really interesting. I think, as we think about the implications for our work today, it's really important to just keep in mind, one, that these are imposed social constructs that were not necessarily from identities that local people or people ascribe to themselves, right? But I think it is really interesting to see that. Thank you for that history lesson for us on the New Spain system.
I just think it's important to understand like the context of, like, in the past, social organization was like very important to societies because, like, to them, anarchy was always just one wrong person in government away. And we don't look at it that way. Our idea is social mobility is like a core part of our being. But in the past, social mobility wasn't always viewed as like a good thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Good point. Other observations or questions, things you'd like to share from your experiences?
I can share a little bit. Thanks, Dustin. That was, I did not know the history on that. That was, I feel like I was in like history class again. That was.
I have an entire lecture about it. If you want to read it.
I can tell. No, I was thinking about maybe just students like comfort in talking about race. This past summer, I was tasked with creating a kind of DEI workshop for Chinese students. And I think even like we were kind of going over it, sort of the basic kind of terminology around identity and what that means. And I think that students there weren't really like used to talking about it or maybe as comfortable talking about it. And because of the sort of lack of freedom of speech, we couldn't really talk about Chinese issues like ethnic cleansing that was going on like while that workshop was going on. So we had to use American examples. So I also feel like maybe students have different exposure to how they're able to talk about race, what like terminology they have, and just even if it's like allowed in their home country.
A great point. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure all Americans have skills to talk about race yet either, but it certainly is something that I think many education systems are working to develop in students, right, from a very young age. And that's certainly not something that we see in every country. Yeah, it's a great example. What an interesting project, Alyssa. Great. Well, I appreciate everyone taking the time to think about this during the lunch hour. And thank you so much, everyone, for comments and questions, and Dustin for all of the deep history. I know it's a busy time, so thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.